Hello code artists, welcome to lesson 7 of our introductory programming logic course. In this lesson we're going to talk all about file input and output, or the shorthand name is file IO. And to do this we're going to need to create a new folder on the hard drive, and we're going to have a new file that we're going to work with. But before we get started, I need you to see that for brevity's sake I simply left all of the code in here from the last lesson because essentially we are going to just be refactoring the code from the last lesson to add the additional functionality that they're asking for right here. So go ahead and pause the video, read what the requirements are, and I'll be waiting here for you when you're done. Okay, now that we've read the requirements, you can see that the school has asked us to refactor our program that we wrote for them for lesson 6 to give them the ability to save the data to the hard drive, which is important because all of the data that we've been using up to this point is only stored in the random access memory of the computer, which, as you know, is volatile memory, which means when you shut the program off or turn the device off, anything that was stored in there is gone forever. So we need a more permanent way to store data, and you do that by using permanent storage devices like hard drives or flash drives, and you have files on there that you write to. So as you can see here, I've created a new folder for our project called data, and in there I have a CSV file, which stands for comma separated value. It's the smallest atomic level database, proto-database that we can work with in programming. And this is what it looks like. You'll see that each line represents, for example, the row of a multi-dimensional array. And then each comma separates the column. So here we have last name, first name, date of birth, grade level, and then gender. And then the next one is the next row in the multi-dimensional array, and then there are the data points for that. So what we're going to learn in this particular code is how to pull this data into our program, and then at the very end how to take the data that's updated in our program and put it back into this file right here. So in order to be able to do that, I have to make a couple of small changes up here at the top. First of all, I need to add a new library because Node doesn't have it built in by default, but the library does come with Node by default, so you won't have to do any installation for it or anything. You just simply have to include it, and I include it up here in the top in my section 1, and I am calling it IO for input output, and the name of the library is FS. That's what we're going to be using. Here are our global variables that we had from the last one, and then as you can see down here, I've got my mutators for those right down here, just like we had in the last code. I made a small little change right here on this one to show you a different technique than I did in the last lesson 6, so your mileage may vary. Go ahead and choose whichever one you like best. I just wanted to show you there was more than one way to skin the cat there. Alright, so we're going to add a couple more variables here. I'm going to come in here and add a numeric variable right there called menu choice, and I did that because I created a small little menu to be able to allow the staff at the school to choose what they want to do since we're adding functionality. And then I'm going to put and some of these didn't change, so I probably should have already had them in there. I'm going to go ahead and put my students and reward students arrays in there, just like we had from the last video. And there we go. So the first thing I think we should probably work on is the menu choice mutator. So let's come down and add that in right after. We'll come down and add it right down. Let's see. We'll add it down here. There we go. Okay. So all I've done right here is, instead of asking them one simple question, I'm looking for them to enter a 1, 2, 3, or a 4, which is anything off of this menu right here. And the cursor will be blinking down here when this displays on the screen. And you'll notice that I've tabbed them in. These are escape characters for tabs, so it kind of, it doesn't go in the middle of the screen, but it goes over to the right a little bit. So that's all I'm doing right here is just a simple mutator for the menu choice. It looks fancy, but it's nothing like you haven't already seen before. So that's all we're doing right there. All right, and then I need to have my mutator for loading the data in off of the hard drive. So we'll start with the actual inputting of the data right now, the file IO. So we're going to copy and paste this, and it's going to come in right after continue response mutator method. And here we go. So the first thing I want to do is create a little local variable to this method right here that uses the IO, which is what I called the FS library up here, read file sync method, which means synchronous. And when you take higher level JavaScript classes, you'll really get way more deep into synchronous versus asynchronous programming. But for right now, for the very basics class here, this is all we're doing. So I'm going to do io.readFileSync, and then I'm passing it two parameters: where the file is located and what its name is, which is right here in data, students data, students_data.csv, and then the type of data that we're working with, which in this particular case we want to pass it UTF-8. That's the default standard. It's the easiest thing to use. You can Google what that is and learn all about the different data types that we work with, but UTF-8 is universal, so that's what we're doing. Okay, so I take that and I read it into this variable right here as a big glob of data, is essentially how it goes in, as one big blob of all of the data from that file. Then, the next line, I take this variable right here called students file and I pass it to the toString method. So I take that blob and I pass it to toString, and then I pass the results of that to a string method called split, which I split on the new lines. This is the regular expression right here to split on carriage returns or new lines. And so now I take and make a single dimensional array where each box in the array is each line of that file right here. So this is box 1, this is box 2, right here, this is box 2, and then this is box 3. So 0, 1, 2 is what I meant to say, sorry. And then down here, what this for loop does right here is it now splits on the comma instead of the new lines and pushes them into a new array that we've declared up here. Not a new one, but the global one that we have up here. So I'm pushing everything that's split on the comma into the boxes of this students array. So then in the end, we wind up with our multi-dimensional array where this is box 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, 2, 0, 3, 0, 4, 1, 0, 1, 1, 1, 2, 1, 3, 1, 4. You get the idea. So that's the easiest technique right here to split the data up on new lines and then push it after you split it on commas so that it becomes a multi-dimensional array. So now we've got the data loaded in off of that CSV file into memory, and we can work with it just like we did in the last lesson because it's just simply a multi-dimensional array. Sorry, I just hit the microphone with my thumb. I apologize if that was loud in your ear. Okay, so then the next thing that we want to be able to do is we want them to be able to modify the student data. So I'm going to come down here after my set num students right in here, and we're going to paste in the new modify students method, and it looks a little bit different than the last one did in lesson 6, so let's take a look at it. Okay, this is a new line that I haven't showed you yet. I don't expect you to memorize it, but almost every language has a way to clear the screen so that when you output stuff you don't see, and that's all this is in JavaScript. This is the simple way to just clear the terminal screen, and then it will display the stuff down here without all of the clutter from the previous stuff. So that's all that is right there, and all you have to do in our code repository is copy and paste it in your code if you want that functionality as well. But I get asked about that in every class. How do I clear the screen? So there you go. All right, just like we had before, our minimum grade and our maximum grade. Little counter here that I'm setting to 1. And you'll notice that now in this method called modify students, I have a parameter that I'm looking for. And you'll see from the main method, I'm going to pass it a parameter based on what they choose right up here in the menu, which down here, based on what they choose here is where I'm going to pass in. Are they going to add a student to the array so a new student is enrolled, or did a student leave the school and they need to remove that student? And then I come down here and we start the process. So I say, well, if add delete is equal to add a student, I come down here and say, well, num students is greater than 0. So I'm asking them up above with num students, how many students are they adding? And I say let new student equal to the array dot length, so the length of the array. I make it multi-dimensional on that one box right there, and then we go through the standard questions just like we did before. Increment our counter, but down here I decrement our number of students so that they're only adding the number of students. They're only going to get prompted to add the number of students that they said they wanted to add to this. So that's all that's happening right here. Now this little console log right here is just a way for me to get a new line on there without looking like it was 2 new lines. It was a little hack that I did there. You know, when you run the code, you'll see what I'm talking about. Feel free to practice or test out what the difference between what I did and what this does right here, and you'll see what I'm talking about. Okay. So if they choose delete student, so if they're passing in a parameter for delete student, then I come down here and notice I'm not doing an else if test. I don't need to do another if test because if it's not add student, and I've already validated, so it is either going to be a 0 or a 1, then all I simply do is I come down here and I say I create a little null or a undefined variable, and I run the list students method, which is where is our list students method? Did I not put it in here yet? Oh, let's put it in there. Control C, come down here and put it right below that. There we go. There's our list students method. So what this method does right here is it prints out a line that kind of gives you a guide for what is getting print out, and then it does a new line, and then it puts like a line below it. And then I go through the array students, and I say as long as I is less than the length of the array, students.length, go through and print out the line number and then the student's information right here. And at the last one, I need to put a new line there so it jumps down and prints out the next kid's data on a new line. So that's all that I'm doing right here is I'm listing every single kid in the array. So I do that right here and I say list the students, and I say as long as delete student is undefined, if it's less than 0 or if it's greater than student's length minus 1, so I'm asking them essentially which student do you want to delete, and it's got to be 0 through the last index position. That's why I do the minus 1, because length starts at 1 and goes to the size of the array. This makes sure that we're doing 0 through the last thing in the array. Okay, I ask them, please enter student number to delete, and they can choose which one because that's what gets printed right here is the student that they want to delete. And if they don't answer correctly, I keep looping right through there. And then this is how you delete an element out of the array. You use the splice method for the array, and you say I want you to splice at this index position, and I only want you to remove one element. So it essentially gets rid of that student out of there, and I am only doing one element as opposed to start here and go over a total of 3. I'm only doing one, and then it shifts everything over to the left in the array. So if you were to print it out, you'd see everything shifted to the left, and the other students would have new index numbers. Okay, so that covers everything that we wanted to cover there. So we've got input, we've got output, we've got how to do the menu, we've got how to list the students here, this last method that I'm going to put in here, and then we're going to fill out the main method. The last method that I want to put in here is how to write the data back to the hard drive. Okay, so to write the data, I have a little method for it. I say the number of columns because there are 5 data points here, so 5 columns. Just like I normally do, I've got my nested for loops to go through the multi-dimensional array. So as long as it's students.length, which are the number of rows, if students I, meaning there's something there, I come through and I say I want to drain everything out of each column of that row for students, so I do the append file sync. There is a write file, but if you do that, you're going to overwrite the file every time you write to it, so the better choice is to do the append file sync. And just like we had with the read file sync, the append file sync has 2 arguments, the file that you want to write to, and you'll notice that it's a different file name, and you'll see why here in just a second. So I'm writing out to a new file. If the file does not exist, it will be created, which is what we want. And then I'm writing out the column information with a comma at the end. And then, as long as it's not the last element in the entire file or the entire array, I make sure I put a new line after the last column. So after the 5th column, I put a new line, and then I keep going. And if it happens to be the last student in the entire file, I don't want a new line, so I simply write the data out to the file without a new line. Because if you write it with a new line and then try to import the data back in, it's going to import that new line as all undefined data. So this is the way that I make sure that at the very end of the file, there's no new line. Then, since we're working with a new file here, I use the unlink sync method of my IO FS library, and I remove this file. That's what unlink does, is it deletes this file right here. Then I rename the new file to be the old file name. So essentially, I delete the old file, then I take the new file, rename it to the old file name, and I'm right back where I started with fully updated data. Alright, so the last thing that we need to cover here is the main method. You see I left some of the same stuff in here that we had before. So I'm going to come up here. The very first thing I do when I'm doing file I/O, in this particular program especially, is I want to run the load data method here. So load students was the method that we had down here that read the data off the hard drive and loaded it into the multi-dimensional array. And then there's our standard set continue response, and then there's our while loop for continue response. And the inside of that is going to look like this. So I paste that in there. I create a little local constant, a couple constants for this while loop. Add student is 0, delete student is 1. And then I did the set menu choice where I come down and ask them right here what they want to do. And then I use, this is a perfect example of a good usage of the switch logic. So I take the menu choice, and if they typed in a 1, I run this method, then I run this method, but I pass this, which is a 0, I pass that down to the modify students. And if you remember, if I pass a 0 right here, then I come down and run this. Otherwise, I must be trying to delete a student, and then I'll run that instead. So that's all I'm doing right there. If they choose modify students, then I pass, or excuse me, if they choose 2, which is delete student, then I run modify students and pass the delete student value, which is 1. If they choose 3, then I simply list the students. And if they choose 4, I run like I did in the last one. I run the determine reward student and then display the reward student. And if none of that happens, which it should never get to that, I just display an error. I just like to have the default on there because that's how I am. I leave it on there so it's for whatever reason. All right. Line 40 is where I go back and ask them again, do you want to continue? And while they choose 1, we just keep on going through that right there. And then at the very end, outside of that loop, once they choose 0, no, they don't want to continue, I write the data on line 42, and then I clear the screen just for grins. So that is File I/O in a nutshell. Please make sure you study the code on the repository and watch this video as many times as you need to really understand what's going on. Okay, thank you very much, and I'll see you on the next video.